Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Bill Gephardt Show podcast. Now, we're going to start with some big news from the Utah governor's office, where Spencer Cox has issued an executive order in the battle to save the Great Salt Lake. To make that happen, the Great Salt Lake Causeway berm will be raised by 5 feet. That'll increase the lake's overall depth and decrease its salinity. How successful the plan will be remains to be seen, but it is an aggressive response to a looming environmental and economic disaster we've been hearing about for years. Now, just hours before the governor issued his executive order, I spoke with one of the country's foremost experts on the Great Salt Lake, and that is Dr. Baxter. She's a professor at Westminster College. She's the director of the Great Salt Lake Institute and has been studying the lake's decline for years. So Dr. Baxter, you can imagine, knows about and has written extensively about the perilous state of the lake, what it's in right now, and why losing it would change life as we know it in the state of Utah.
This podcast brought to you by these fine sponsors of local journalism. Legacy Roofing, Northern Utah's best residential roofing company. Reach out for your free estimate. Need a tow? Always ask for Stoffers, the honest Utah towing company. The Brad DeBry Personal Injury Law Firm, the attorney you know, the experience you trust. ES Solar, the best solar contractor in the West. Let them show you how to save with solar power. Safe, clean energy for the future.
I worry about the Great Salt Lake. As I mentioned, I'm a fellow who has a sailboat out there, and just hanging out there. I was just out there last weekend running around in the reeds with my dog. It's a wonderful place to be. But it's there was a channel that we would take our boat, and my boat draws about 4.5 or 5 feet of water, and it was 6 or 7 feet in there. And now in this channel that gets from the Great Salt Lake Marina out into the Great Salt Lake, you can walk across it, and it comes up to about your knees, and it's up a foot from about a month ago. What do you think of all of this stuff? That's a man-made problem, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. So I recently paddleboarded across that channel to get to the reef on the other side and take some samples, because we're monitoring.
Which used to be underwater, I might add.
Yes,
that reef was underwater. Yeah,
should be underwater, because that's what feeds the ecosystem. So these microbialites that I study formed this reef, and they should have a thick green mat of microbes that are helping the brine flies.
Can I interrupt a minute about that reef? Because we think of reefs as being formed by coral little critters that we can see. And tell me about this. That reef is actually formed by, can I call it coral-like bacteria that grow and die and hang on to each other? Tell me about that.
No, I think I like the word reef, because it is calcium carbonate. It's similar to like the vestige of a coral reef, but corals are animals. And so it's not like coral, but it is biology that causes that calcium carbonate to precipitate. It's
calcium. Oh, okay. Yeah. So, all right. Well, I'm half right then. Keep going.
Yes, you are. And so these microbes grow in a mat on the surface, and we call it a microbialite, but that's the parent term. There are different types of microbialites. Some people have heard of stromatolites. That's one type. We have all different kinds of types in Great Salt Lake. So we use that word microbialite. So it forms a mat which does photosynthesis, and that causes the calcium carbonate to precipitate out of the water. Okay. So it's literally rocks that are made by biology. So I love that. And so if they get dried out, where the water recedes and they get too dry, then those mats are destroyed. And those mats are the foundation of the ecosystem of Great Salt Lake. So if you don't have the mats, you can't feed the brine flies and the brine shrimp. And you've got to have algae in the water column, and you've got to have these mats on the bottom. And if you don't have that, we can't bring in sun's energy to the system and feed it. So what you're talking about with that reef being exposed right now is really detrimental to the whole ecosystem. 10 million birds depend on that lake.
Is it going to come back? Is the great, because, I was out there, like I said, last weekend. I talked to some yacht clubbers out there, all of us bemoaning all of our boats sitting up on dry dock. Is it going to come back? Because it came up a foot in the last couple of weeks because of all the snow and rain or whatever that we had. And then there's a little bit of foot, doesn't do much. It's got to come up like 5 or 6 feet, right? Is it going to come back, do you think?
Yeah, so this is an unusual year, and I don't really study atmospheric science, but I understand that an El Nino year brings, surface temperatures in the ocean and currents in a different way to the weather systems than years where that is not the case. And so I think we're getting a little bit of a reprieve early in our season because of that. So last year, if we look at last winter, not this winter, what happened was we got early snows in December, and during the whole inflow of precipitation after we'd hit a historic low at the lake came up a foot, and then in the summer it went down 2.5 feet. So I'm really happy that we're up a foot right now, and that might mean by spring that we'll be up, I don't know, 1.5 feet, 2 feet.
That won't cover the coral, I don't think, will it? That won't,
No.
or the reef, not the coral, but it won't cover the reef that we're talking about.
That's right. It won't be enough, and we will likely lose that much or more. So what happens is with the direct precipitation, so direct precipitation is great for the lake, but we really rely on inputs from rivers. And if the water gets used upstream, which is, as you point to, this human-caused diversion disaster.
Diversion to crops, to people, to houses, yes.
Right. So we're diverting too much water. And so it's great that we have a good water year, but upstream from the lake, all of the aquifers are really dry. All the reservoirs are really dry. So we've got to fill those first. And we're very unlikely to get significant input from this runoff. So direct precipitation is good, but I don't know how it's going to impact input later.
Is this because a man-made cause at the Great Salt Lake, or because of Salt Lake, or is this because of climate change? Which, there's climate change. Yeah, because yes, there's more population here. We're using more water. We're the biggest crop that we have to water is grass, which nothing except horses eat that, which is not bad for horses. But yeah, climate change, and the tributaries and whatever leading into this dead end lake. It's not called dead end. What's it called again?
A terminal lake.
Terminal lake, yeah, dead
end. But it's like a dead end. It's the bottom of the basin, and it doesn't. It really depends on water to flow into it through the rivers in order for it to fill, because it's not a deep, it's not a really deep lake. It's very shallow. So it's not like Mono Lake, like Crater Lake, where it's really deep. Instead, it's very shallow. So it's more like a plate than a bowl, if you will. And so that means much of its water is next to the air and can easily evaporate. So that causes a problem for Great Salt Lake. So even when we get water to it, so we mentioned the diversion problem, that is humans causing that problem. And now we get to climate change, which is a different human-caused problem. But climate change is definitely giving us warmer summers. That's increasing evaporation rates. So I think we're facing both things now, but we've set ourselves up to not be able to resist these changes in climate, because now we have all these water rights and diversions in place, and it's much harder to dismantle that because that requires changing water policy.
I know, but a couple of things. There's many questions here I have for you, but one that seems ridiculous to me, and that is pumping water up a mile up in the air and 1,000 miles across the mountains, which is the proposal that's on the table now to pump water in a pipeline, I guess, from the Pacific Ocean to the Great Salt Lake. That's the amount of energy to bring water up seems outrageous and incredible to me. What about you?
Well, it's not a good climate consideration, first of all, because a lot of carbon will be burned to create that pathway.
Just in fuel to electricity.
Yes.
Yeah.
The second thing is that it's not a good solution to bring salt water to Great Salt Lake. What we need is fresh water, not salt.
I see.
It's not a good solution because it's terribly expensive. So we'll be spending money. And a scientist at BYU just last week published an analysis of this plan, and points to the climate cost, the financial cost, the energetic cost. And if you look at all of that, it seems really unrealistic. And there's a much simpler solution,
Which is?
which is just to reduce the water diversions. It's easier, it's cheaper, and farmers don't have to go without a livelihood. There are ways to, buy people out of water rights, for them to lease water rights back to the state for the use for the lake. That was part of the legislation that was passed last year. So that water, that secondary water, soon will be metered. The rollout of the meters is going to take a couple of years. Agriculture folks can finally know how much water they're using.
Yeah.
They can understand how much of it they can afford to lease back to the state. And there's water optimization programs going on to try to look at, should we be growing a different crop in the desert?
Okay.
Alfalfa is very water hungry, right?
I understand. But we didn't have this problem. And I want to know if you think, because I'm just literally not positive whether diversion is the problem or climate change.
Yeah.
Because we used to have the snowpack, we used to have the rain, we used to have a different climate that wasn't quite so hot and produced more water out of the sky. So is it climate change or diversion, or is it 50-50?
I would say it's probably 80-20 with diversions in the running. And that's
diversion is 80%?
I would say so.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Because we really aren't getting the water into the system that we could, but also because there's negative feedback loops. So, that snowpack that we get, you're right, it's different, but also it melts differently now, because dust from the Great Salt Lake bed can land on the snow and cause it to warm up more quickly in the spring and melt more quickly, which causes more evaporation, which leads to less water in the lake, which leads to more dust, which lands on the snow again, so it becomes this terrible negative feedback loop. And so you can't really look at one thing without the other thing. It's both water diversions and climate change. And those are both things that we can look at how to work around. And I think the thing that we can do the most about as humans is fix the water diversion problem. That's the thing we can do more immediately than fix the climate problem.
So what if the Great Salt Lake dries up? Big deal. It's not the first salt lake, not Great Salt Lake. That's an actual Great Salt Lake, of which Salt Lake City is named. But what other salt lakes in California, for example, have dried up? What has been the problem with that? And what is the problem if the Great Salt Lake dries up?
Yeah. So we've done 2 experiments. So as a scientist, I like to do an experiment to answer a question. So we've done experiments that address the question you're asking. In the 1920s and 30s, folks said about the Owens Lake in the valley, they said, we don't use this water for anything.
In the valley?
Yeah.
Which valley?
The Owens Valley.
Okay.
So in California, and there's a great movie called Chinatown, which talks about this, right? So there was a company called LA Water and Power, which to me is just the greatest name for a company, because it was about power of water.
All we can remember is Jack Nicholson cut his nose. That's all we can remember about that. But go ahead. Go ahead. That's a different subject.
And he has that bandage on the whole movie.
Yes, he does.
Yeah. So they were able to buy the water for the city of LA and build an aqueduct that brought that water to the city. Mm-hmm. So that was the experiment. What would happen if we removed the water from a lake what would happen? Nothing bad, I'm sure. We'd all have water. Well, that's not what happened. What happened is the Owens Lake basin became a dry dust bowl and made the worst PM 2.5 pollution ever measured in the US. So we did the experiment, we found out the result, and then what do we do to fix it? Well, guess what LA Power and Water had to do? They had to collect money from the people using that water in LA, and people in LA now still pay 20% of their water bill. That goes to put water back in Owens Lake. So how do we fix it? We put water back into it. So, and that's the solution. Now we've got birds going back to that valley and these little refugia ponds. It's not the same as it used to be.
Was that salt water?
It is now, because it's not
Okay.
enough water to make it fresh.
Okay.
So we did an experiment. What happens if we take the water away? How do we fix it now that we know it causes pollution? And we put water back on it, and it's expensive. All of that was expensive. Building the aqueduct was expensive.
Yep.
Now returning the water to sprinkle it is expensive. So we don't want to do that experiment at Great Salt Lake. We've already done it. We know what the results are. And if we pretend we don't, we're lying to ourselves. It's currently going on in Iran with Lake Urmia. It happened at the Aral Sea in Uzbekistan. It has happened with the Dead Sea. All over the world, we've done this experiment already. So let's not pretend like we don't know what will happen.
What will happen? Is it Armageddon for the air? Will we have to move out and wear masks, or is that exaggerated?
I don't think it's exaggerated. I think every citizen along the Wasatch Front knows exactly what happens when air quality gets bad. We're experiencing that in this month.
So in a terminal lake,
yep,
every single thing, microbe, piece of chemistry,
heavy metal,
every heavy metal that flowed into the lake by hook or by crook, by pollution or anything else over the last millenniums, that stays there. The water goes away, but all the minerals and heavy metals and stuff stay there. And if the lake goes away, you're telling me that the wind comes along and blows that up, and it'll blow it downwind and make it so that we can't live here anymore?
Yeah.
Really? Is it that bad?
I think the valley could become unlivable. I mean, you see what the inversions look like, in our every January. So we know air pollution can be bad in this valley. So now imagine all of that dust you just described with all of the nasties that are in it blowing against the Wasatch Front. And this will be, this lake is 10 to 12 times the size of Owens Lake.
Yes.
And if that was the worst air pollution disaster in our country, we're looking at something 10 times worse. So that, I don't think it's hyperbole. I don't think it's exaggeration to say that this is where we're headed if we can't fix this problem.
Sometimes
I think the problem is solvable.
Sometimes when the wind blows out of the west, we get a taste of that in Salt Lake City when some of the lake stink comes across. Is that going to, if it dries up, that's the type of thing that will turn into heavy metal pollution in the air?
Yeah, I think it'll be worse than lake stink. Lake stink, actually, have you noticed we're getting less of that?
Actually, I have. I did. When the wind's still out of the west, sometimes, yes. Why?
Because that's the healthy microbiology of the system, and we should get that little, kind of sulfur smell. Those are the microbes that are turning over the nutrients in the lake. So as the lake shrinks, it's getting saltier and saltier and saltier. And so those normal activities aren't happening because those microbes are struggling to do their work. So I've noticed that I don't smell it as much anymore. And it's actually a little frightening because that means the biology of the system is altered.
And does that stink come from the biology that you talk about? Isn't that because we flush sewage as humans into? No, it's not. Okay.
It's not, because the sewage we flush into it gets cleaned and treated. We do save some money. We don't have to treat it as much as if we were putting it into a freshwater system where fish are. So the lake saves us a little bit of money, but it is clean what goes into there. And there are some residual things like pharmaceuticals. There's a cool study that noticed, what is in Great Salt Lake pharmaceutical wise, looking at other lakes and comparing it. And It's kind of funny. There's a lot more antidepressants and a lot less birth control. So I don't really know what that means.
I know. And the water that's coming out of my tap after it's treated. I don't need to go to the drugstore anymore. I know. It's weird.
No,
All right,
not
leave us.
drinkable
All right.
water.
Now this is fixable. That's what we want to. That's what we want to leave with. I don't know if we'll get around to fixing it in my lifetime or even yours, but it's fixable. How's that?
It is fixable. And I think humans got us into this mess and we can get us out of it. And we have to be smarter than, the folks in the 1920s who diverted water from Owens Lake.
We're fixing the ozone layer, which seemed like an impossibility. All we had to do is use something besides, when we're putting on our deodorant. That was the big sacrifice and other things. Yeah. Exactly.
Well, I think we need to look to last legislative session last year at how many water bills passed that were passed in a unanimous and bipartisan way. And I love that because this is not political. This is really about saving this system and in turn saving our livelihood along the Wasatch Front. So I like to see that the legislators are working together and not fighting about this. And so far in this session, there's been some good collaboration that way.
Good. It's not, because it's not just shrimpers who lose their jobs. It's not just sailors like me who don't get to sail anymore. You talk about our livelihood. You're talking about being a professor at Westminster College or whatever else people do here.
I'm talking about real estate developers. How do you sell houses here? I'm talking about companies that won't get people to move here. If we're living in a natural disaster, people are going to move away. People ask me every day, should I sell my house in Salt Lake City? What do you know? Yeah. So, people are thinking that way. And I think all of those groups you talked about, the ski industry should worry, tourism should worry. All of those groups should want to save Great Salt Lake. I like to say there's a reason for everybody to get motivated about this issue.
I'm motivated. I have been for a long time. And maybe others are getting motivated now too. You say it's not political. So much stuff is everything's political. Anyway, I got to ask you back, at least when the Mars rover gets back, we got to talk about that. I want to talk more about the Great Salt Lake as progress happens. Supposedly it will. Hopefully it will. Dr. Bonnie Baxter, PhD, professor of genetics and astrobiology, and an expert at the Great Salt Lake who says we can go out to the Great Salt Lake today and pick up a little crystal, and there's probably DNA from many millions of years ago in it, right?
That's right.
Thank you, Bonnie. See you next time.
Thank you for your curiosity. I always love talking to you.
All right. Bye-bye.
That'll do it for this edition of the Bill Gephardt Show podcast. And now for the latest in local breaking news coverage 24/7, check out GephardtDaily.com. See you next time.